gracias por acompañarnos. Muchos de los que están acá son parte de instituciones de memoria, o curadores, o artistas, o públicos, así que creo que va a ser una tarde fructífera, con mucha energía, con mucha, no sé, movilización. A mí me movilizó mucho la conferencia de Joe anoche, así que espero que les suceda lo mismo. Y quiero agradecerle especialmente a Joe Rosenthal y a todo el equipo que ha venido de Londres, que han ya marcado un link con el caso argentino. Me parece que eso habla de esto, de cómo los traumas, como el problema de la sangre, no sé, en fin, todos los temas de la memoria son absolutamente universales, y me parece que ayer, cuando terminó la charla de Joe y puso el capítulo argentino, me pareció que ahí era el futuro de lo que viene entre nosotros, así que se lo quiero agradecer muy especialmente, porque para nosotros es muy importante el trabajo que hacen las abuelas, el trabajo que hacen los organismos, y te lo quiero agradecer a vos, por supuesto a Cecilia, a Bryce, a todo el equipo. Y nada más, ahora le voy a dejar la palabra, creo, no sé si Flor o Cecilia, cómo es el orden, y gracias.
Bueno, hola a todos y a todas de nuevo. Yo les quería contar un poquito el marco en el que se genera esta charla y este encuentro y esta actividad que vamos a estar haciendo hoy. La hacemos en el marco de un proyecto que se llama Staging Difficult Paths of Objects, Narratives and Public Memory. Es la puesta en escena de pasados conflictivos sobre narrativas, objetos y memoria pública. Y este es un proyecto que tiene sede en Royal Holloway, que es de parte de la Universidad de Londres. El director del proyecto está aquí con nosotros, es Bryce Lees, y está también María Delgado allá en el fondo, co-investigadora del proyecto. El proyecto lo que trata de hacer es crear un vínculo transnacional para pensar cuestiones que tienen que ver con objetos, memoria pública y narrativas. Y lo que buscamos hacer es crear un puente para que instituciones, sitios de memoria, instituciones artísticas o curadores y artistas puedan pensar de una manera nueva algunos problemas. Es un placer enorme, yo tenerte acá, y la verdad que bueno, arrancamos.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all of these incredibly warm welcomes, which has been our experience for the last week that we've been in Argentina. It's really amazing to be here. Nora, thank you. I can't see Nora, but the thanks that you gave to me, I reflect back to you many, many times over. For me, we were talking over lunch about, we come from England, and the moment everything is about Brexit, it's about making the world smaller and locking out the rest of the world. And so transnational projects like this are incredibly important opportunities for conversation and dialogue, and for you, Nora and Florencia, to invite us to work in this collaborative way with the Memory Park. It's an amazing opportunity, and many, many thanks. Thanks, obviously, of course, to Cecilia and Bryce and Maria for involving me in this amazing project, Staging Difficult Paths, which has actually made me think very, very differently about exhibitions that I've worked on, and it is already beginning to generate new ideas and new projects. Today, I'm honoured to be speaking with such an interesting group of people. You all come from very different backgrounds, different professional contexts. We have a very sort of creative, diverse bunch of people, and what I want to do is share with you some examples of, as the title says, exhibiting absence and loss, examples of museums working around this theme, of artists working around this theme, archives, memorials. And when I was preparing this, talking with Florencia and Cecilia, I was very aware of the people that were going to be in the room, and so I've tried to find examples of, that I hope will resonate with you all, and that I hope will provoke a conversation that we can all join in with once I'm finished. I've organised the case studies that I want to show you into 10 principles, if you like. So the first principle that I want to suggest is show what's missing. If we're talking about exhibiting absence and loss, the simplest thing is show what's missing. And this example, I thought, before bringing to you, I thought, how can I bring this example to the memory part, to the context of Argentina and dictatorship, post-dictatorship Argentina? This is too mundane, it's too simple, but I think it's maybe a good starting point, because the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in the USA in Boston, does anybody know the museum? I think most people that do know the museum know it for one reason, that in the 1990s, 13 important paintings were stolen from the museum. And you can see some frames that are hanging and they're missing paintings. And the reason is that those paintings were stolen. I think a Vermeer was stolen, a Rembrandt was stolen. And the museum had the question, what do we do? How do we respond to this absence? This quote you see is from the website of the museum, and it represents their decision to show some of the frames that were left when the paintings were stolen. They hung the empty frames. Today, empty frames remain hanging in the museum as a placeholder for the missing works and as symbols of hope awaiting their return. The museum also invited the artist Sophie Calle, the French artist Sophie Calle, to create some interventions in the space around this idea of the missing artwork. The first was in 1991, and it was simply interviewing security guards, curators, people who worked at the museum about their memories of the artworks, and exhibiting the texts from the interviews, as well as photographs of what was left behind on the walls. And Sophie Calle returned in 2013 and noticed that the empty frames were hanging on the wall, and realized that many visitors didn't really realize what they were looking at. They thought the frames maybe had some significance themselves. They didn't know that they were looking at an absence. So she produced a new artwork called What Do You See?, where you see visitors and people who work at the museum looking at these empty spaces. So that's just a starting point. It's very literal. It's a very literal interpretation of how do we show what's not there. The second example, and I've titled this Show What's Left Unseen, or show maybe what it's not possible to show, what's usually not shown. And this is an example from London, actually, just over 10 years ago. It's in a very interesting exhibition space called the Welcome Collection, which I really recommend. It's not on the tourist map as much as it should be, and I think it does the best exhibitions in London, in my opinion. This was a very, very simple exhibition, very, very upsetting and powerful, but very, very simple. The idea was that a photographer interviewed and met with around 20 people of all different ages, from a baby to an elderly woman that we see here. The one thing they all had in common was that they were living in a hospice. They were terminally ill. They all knew that they were about to die. And the idea of the concept was the photographer got permission to photograph the individuals before they died and just after they died. So, just to show you what that looked like in the space, it's a very, very minimalist concept. Before death and after death. The exhibition was called Life Before Death, and I actually saw it just without planning to go. I just stumbled across it one day, and it was incredibly moving. But the photographs of the individuals were blown up very large, they were enlarged, and there was very little information, apart from a very brief text edited from conversations that the photographer had together with a journalist, I believe, conversations with the person who was just about to die. And this is one example. This is a lady called Beate Tauber, who died of cancer at just 44 years old. And the quote that she gave, which was in the exhibition, was, "I think that after I've died, the suffering won't show on my face. If my soul is able to float away, as I hope it will, I will lie there completely at peace. And a lot of people that came to the exhibition were, I think, taken aback by how peaceful the photographs were. There wasn't any suggestion of pain. There was a sort of ghostly, haunting quietness to the after photos. The next example I wanted to bring was, I think, the very first thing that I thought about when we discussed this workshop. I hope you agree that it has something interesting, it resonates in an interesting way in Argentina, particularly sitting in the Memory Park as we are just by the monument to the victims of the dictatorship, or to state terrorism, actually. So this principle, as I've written it, is to make visible the presence of absence, to find a way, how do we find a way to show what no longer exists? But importantly, even though it's not there, it's still felt. So the absence is present in some way. This is a photograph from a wonderful film called Reflecting Memory, which is by a French artist called Kader Attia, whose work I absolutely love. He's French-Algerian, and his work really deals with the idea of trauma and the idea of repair and healing. It's incredibly poetic and layered and deceptively simple. It's very, very profound, and this film I found very moving, particularly thinking I was deeply immersed in conversations with Cecilia at the time about trying to educate myself on Argentine history, and I really saw this film in a different way, I think, because of this project. So you're looking at a photograph of a man with one arm, and he looks like he has two arms because there's a mirror reflecting the one arm against itself. The project was a film that used the metaphor of the medical condition phantom limb syndrome, where somebody has lost a limb, an arm or a leg, maybe through a bomb explosion, maybe because of a medical condition, and they've lost the limb but they still feel the limb. It's a very common condition, and it's very disturbing. So they'll feel pain in a limb that doesn't exist. They'll feel the pain of something that's not there. In the film, he uses this condition, which is a very specific medical condition, as a metaphor for collective trauma, for societies that are traumatized, that are incomplete, that need to heal, but can't heal. I think a very interesting example of how to visualize absence, and particularly traumatic loss, because it suggests that only only through being able to see ourselves as whole, whether that's an individual or a society, and only by acknowledging and showing what's not there, and again, everything sounds different to me as we're sitting right by the monument in the Memory Park. Only by showing what's not there is there any hope of any sort of, maybe repair is the wrong word, but any sort of processing and moving forward, reconciliation possibly, internally, individually, collectively. So just to show some more photographs, the film uses mirrors. I should also say that in between these very poetic scenes, in many of them you can't actually notice the mirrors are there. So you actually think you're just looking at somebody with a DJ mixing music. It's only later in the film that you see the mirrors. And these scenes are interspersed with interviews with surgeons, therapists, psychoanalysts, sociologists, people who study conflict societies, and they're reflecting on the condition of phantom limb syndrome, and talking about what it means, how it can help us understand societies that have suffered trauma. So these are some more images from the exhibition. I think they're incredibly beautiful, and in this one in particular, it's difficult to notice the mirror. Only if you look closely can you see that it's there. And here's a quote from the artist, from Kader Attia. I'll read it out, but you can see it. Reflection about the complexity of memory, the working of memory, the duty of memory, and its representation. Sorry, the work is about these things, and it's about repair as a form of reappropriation, but above all, as a form of resistance. And again, the lady that we see sitting at the typewriter has one arm, The second example to bring in the context of this idea of making present what's absent is very different, and this is an artist working in Germany, but I believe she's North American, Quinten Anna Wixwo, and she did a piece that was aimed at recording or documenting the site in Dachau concentration camp where female prisoners were held and sexually abused by German officials. It's known as the brothel, but in reality it wasn't really a brothel, there wasn't any consent. When she went to Dachau, she noticed that there was nothing there. She had the military maps from the wartime, and she knew where the site was, but she couldn't find it. And I think people who are familiar with Holocaust sites in Europe, you'll know that this isn't new. The one thing that seems to be true across concentration camp sites is that these brothels haven't been kept. They've not been preserved in any way. In many cases, they've been destroyed, as if the memory is something that's too painful, too difficult to remember. It's been decided that it's almost better to forget than to remember. So she visited the concentration camp and she asked the staff who worked there, the former concentration camp, and she asked, how can I find the brothel where the women were kept? And she was met with an awkward silence, and people didn't want to talk about this. So she decided that this should be her project, showing this absence, showing visualizing in some way a story that people didn't feel comfortable showing. And the way she did this was by producing photographs using film cameras that were defective, that no longer worked. They were historic film cameras that had actually been manufactured by slave laborers in Dachau at the time for the Agfa film company. And she created these distorted, textured photographs by putting flowers that she found on the site in between the lens and the film inside the old cameras. So there's no digital manipulation going on here. The idea, I guess, being that the trauma and the suffering the women experienced is somehow reflected in these damaged photographs. And just to say, I saw this work initially in a very interesting exhibition called A Time for Everything, Rituals Against Forgetting, which was all about Jewish rituals and how they are built around the idea of preventing us from forgetting something, whether that's forgetting the creation of the world. We need to remember the creation of the world, we need to remember the Exodus, we need to remember a birth or a death. This work was exhibited as remembering a taboo, the need to remember things that people don't want to remember. So, number 4, again, another case study that I think might be interesting for you, confronting visitors with the complicity of looking. Because when we talk about traumatic material, it's not easy to show, and something happens when you bring it to visitors in a public space. This is an exhibition that was in Austria at the Jewish Museum Vienna in 1997. I think it was a very experimental exhibition. I think it was very ahead of its time, even though 1997 isn't really very long ago. Did anybody see it out of interest? No. I don't know if there was a catalogue, but I think it's a very interesting concept. The images that you see are of death masks that were produced by the Nazis in 1942 as part of medical experiments that were done to Jewish inmates. And the death masks, as well as the skulls of the inmates, were in the collection of a museum in Vienna at the time, and they were later given to the Jewish Museum in Vienna. And they had the question, what to do with this material? Do we show it? What are the ethics of showing such uncomfortable, unpleasant material? What do we want visitors to feel or experience in showing this? So a lot of thought went into the concept of the exhibition, and the first thing that the visitors saw was some context, archival material, setting the scene of medical experimentation, documents, very bureaucratic documents of correspondence between scientists who were conducting the experiments, correspondence between the Nazi officials and the Natural History Museum in Vienna, which is actually where they ended up. And then the visitors walked into the room and saw this. They saw the death masks lined up in a very clinical, almost surgical, uncomfortable light. No interpretation, no captions. They just saw the death masks. You can see some of the heads are up and some of them are down. The curators had very little information about the masks. They talked about the anonymity of these masks as a challenge. Will this dehumanize the victims? They weren't able to identify the masks apart from, in some cases, knowing some names. Hearing from the creators talk about this, it made me think, would it have helped to have known anything about these people, to have been able to talk about them? But the thing I want to show you is how they displayed them. So I showed you this image a minute ago, and I'm showing it you again now. If you notice, as well as the masks, there are actually cameras above them. And most visitors, I don't think, noticed this when they walked into the room. They thought they were looking at the death masks. But actually what was happening was they were being filmed. So this is the next room they walked into, and it's a row of screens with a slight delay broadcasting the moment before when they had walked into the room and been looking at the death masks. And I think what the curators were trying to do was to confront visitors with the act of looking and confront them with the question of what we do with this heritage. In a sense, the visitors were now the objects of the exhibition. The objects of the exhibition, they realized, weren't actually the death masks. It was them. It was not necessarily the history, not necessarily the past, but the present and how we actually confront the past. And I think it's interesting to note that actually visitors, I imagine some people who came to the museum may have felt very uncomfortable seeing themselves there, but actually they were experiencing, they hadn't given any consent to be displayed, and this is exactly like the individuals, the victims, whose death masks were on display. No consent had been given there either. So to move on from that and to a more recent past, there's a memorial I want to show you which I think represents the idea of personalising the loss, which I think is very important. Some of you may be familiar with this memorial because unlike the memorials we have here, it's not fixed into the ground. This is a memorial by Ida Sehovic, who's an artist of Bosnian descent, and it's called Why Are You Not Here? And it's a memorial to the Srebrenica massacre during the Yugoslav wars. It commemorates I think just over 8,000 Bosnian Muslims, men and boys, who were killed in the genocide during the war. And as you can see, it's made up of porcelain cups with coffee, little coffee cups with the coffee in there. The cups were donated by Bosnian families. And this is an image that shows that the memorial was actually participatory. It wasn't something that was fixed in the ground and designed and left there. It was a memorial that forced passers-by to actually engage with it. It was assembled and disassembled in just one day with a team of volunteers and people just in a public square that were passing by. It happens actually every year on the anniversary of the genocide, the 11th of July. The artist actually calls this, she came up with a very nice term to describe this monument. She calls it a nomadic monument because it travels from city to city. I believe usually cities with large populations of Bosnian citizens or Bosnian individuals who moved there, Bosnian immigrants. So every year in a different city, this monument is constructed. People pour coffee, the idea being that the individuals that the monument commemorates aren't there to drink the coffee. So to move on to something that's a little bit more light, I think maybe to generate some laughs maybe in the audience in this very serious presentation. The next thing I want to suggest is the importance of not overlooking the mundane, the everyday, when it comes to mediating difficult subjects. The objects or the material that you're presenting from an exhibition point of view doesn't need to always be obviously traumatic. And the example I wanted to bring is two museums. The first over here is the Museum of Broken Relationships and another museum in England. The Museum of Broken Relationships is a wonderful project that exists in Croatia and exists, I believe, now in Los Angeles, and it also exists on the internet. And it was founded by two artists in Zagreb who were in a relationship, and their relationship ended. And they came up with the idea for a museum or a collection of objects that dealt with this painful process of relationships that end. And the museum deals with relationships that aren't just romantic or sexual, they're also parental relationships, relationships between parent and child, between brother and sister, between friends, any sort of relationships that fail. And at the heart of the concept is one simple object. This is just to show you their website. Anybody can donate objects to this collection. So if you've recently had the misfortune of separating with a partner, you can be part of the museum. They ask you certain questions, and you can either send the object or you can send an image of it, along with your personal story. So this is one example of the sort of object that the museum has. It's a toaster. I think there's something very wonderful that happens when people are surprised by the things they see in museums. It's not a historic artifact, it doesn't look important, but it meant something to someone. And the caption that the person who donated the toaster, that they wrote, I'll read it out to you because you probably can't read it. It says, "This is the toaster of vindication. When I moved out and across the country, I took this toaster. That'll show you. How are you going to toast anything now?" Similarly, and maybe more poignantly, there's an iron in the collection, and this was donated by somebody from Norway. And he wrote simply, "This iron was used to iron my wedding suit. Now it's the only thing I have left." Similarly, I couldn't resist, I could have brought you hundreds of these, but just another quick one. Just a pile of sweets. And the text reads, "I got these for you, but you died first." We don't know what sort of relationship that was, but it makes us ask all sorts of questions. And the wonderful thing about the museum, if you ever had a chance to see it, I saw it when it travelled to Amsterdam in an old church. The wonderful thing is that it's simple, it's cheap to produce, it's one object, it's one caption, sometimes they're printed very simply. But the objects draw people in, and people walk around the museum and they laugh and they cry because there are some very, very upsetting stories there. But they're a very easy entry point to bigger stories. And it's interesting to imagine this model being used for a different sort of narrative. It was a museum of the dictatorship period, or a museum of a particular period of trauma or loss. What objects would people bring, and how would they interpret them for a broader public? And this, just very quickly, is a very similar model of a museum. They call themselves museums, they don't necessarily have buildings, but this is the Museum of Transology, which is obviously a word that's made up. It's a museum that deals with the experience of transgender people, the persecution they may have suffered, the difficulties that they've had with family relationships, with their dealings with the state. And it may be exhibited slightly differently to the Museum of Broken Relationships, but actually it's a very similar model. It's one object and one story. I'll just show you one example. This is in 2 glass jars, 2 breasts that were surgically removed from a transgender person, and they have offered them to the museum, and they're exhibited with the words, and it's sort of a wordplay, a pun. So forgive me if it doesn't perfectly translate to Spanish, but I think it may do. They've written, "Thanks for the mammaries." The idea is mammary is breath, memory is mammaries. Memoria. So, number 7, reconstruct the genealogy of what was lost. And I bring this because I know we have people who work in archives here. And I found an interesting exhibition. I haven't seen it, I saw it online. This was in Barcelona in 2015. And as you can see, it was called Past Disquiet. Narratives and Ghosts from the International Art Exhibition for Palestine. It was in MACBA in Barcelona, and the exhibition happened in 2015. What's interesting to me is this is an exhibition about an exhibition. And the exhibition that it's about was actually an exhibition about exile and loss. The original exhibition happened in Beirut in 1978, and it was interesting actually in the context of Latin America, because it was a group art show which was organized amazingly by the Palestine Liberation Organization, but working very closely with international solidarity groups, anti-fascist groups, anti-imperialist groups, such as the International Resistance Museum for Salvador Allende, which was established in Paris by Chilean artists after the coup in 1973. So many of the people involved in the Allende project worked on this Palestine project. And it was a group art show drawing on networks of anti-fascist networks, and it was destroyed in 1982 because there was bombing during the Lebanon Civil War. So nothing remained of the exhibition. The works were destroyed. I should say it brought together the work of about 200 artists. It was a huge, huge project. And curators at the MACBA found out about this exhibition and did archival research to try and construct the historiography of the exhibition by trying to find any traces they could find of the original exhibition. So here we have an original invitation from 1978, and also the catalogue in Arabic and in English, published in 1978. This led to them contacting the artists who were involved and trying to reconstruct how this exhibition came about, because it was organized by the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, during the Civil War, from another country. The idea being that eventually it would have a permanent home in Palestine. And the archival research that the curators in Barcelona did enabled them to bring the exhibition back to life in a way. So they produced testimonies and interviews with people involved in the exhibition. I won't say too much about it, but I'll just show you some images, because I think for me, any exhibitions that tell a story with material that's archival are interesting. People aren't interested in looking at pieces of paper. And everything in this exhibition was reproduced. There was nothing original. There were photocopies and enlargements and reproductions of all sorts of kinds. And it was a very, very important exhibition that kind of intersected with the academic world and reconstructed something that had almost been forgotten. So another example that I'm going to talk about is actually from the Second World War, from the Holocaust. I call this the importance of letting the voices of the missing actually speak for themselves, finding a way to give voice to the people who are no longer there. The example I want to bring to you is from Warsaw. The Jewish Historical Institute is a very important institute that exists still today. It existed all the way through the communist period, and it has a very important archive on Jewish life in Poland over many, many years. The image that you're looking at is a milk carton. Does anybody know the story? Sorry, sir. Yes. Have you seen the material? The film. Thank you. Yes, there's actually a film, Who Will Write Our History? Yeah, this is very interesting. A wonderful book was written about this, and now a film called Who Will Write Our History? So the story is that during the period of the Warsaw Ghetto, and a group of remarkable people got together and secretly began collecting the history of the history. It wasn't history, collecting the present, collecting what was happening to them, from a ticket to a theatre in the ghetto, to a theatre performance, to official notices on walls, taking them down and keeping them, to diaries and testimonies, photographs, every sort of trace of everyday normal life. They tried to gather because they knew that the future was uncertain. They may not have known that they were about to die, but they knew that something terrible was happening to Jews in Poland, and they felt a duty to try and ensure against future forgetting. to try and find a way to ensure that that what was happening to them would be remembered in the future. The process I won't talk about, but you'll know it. It's truly an amazing story, and it doesn't surprise me that a film has been made about it, because the secret operation was a very dangerous operation. Only a few people knew about it, and the materials that they collected miraculously were found after the war. They were buried in containers like this milk carton. So these are actually the things that the archive was buried in. This is a photograph of it being recovered. And the material is very moving, may not look much, and that's always a problem with archival material, but when you look deeply into it, the stories are enough to make you cry. There are stories of young people talking about knowing that they were about to die and asking the world not to forget them, calling out. When you read the material, it's like people are still speaking to you. It's a very, very emotional and powerful experience. And I have to admit, I haven't actually seen this exhibition. I know the team who created it, but I haven't been. But I just wanted to show you some photos of how they went about exhibiting it, because have you been to the exhibition? So it's relatively recently, the museum have created an exhibition of this archive. It was known as the euphemism Oneg Shabbos, or Oneg Shabbos, which was sort of pleasure of the Sabbath day, and that was the euphemism that they used when they were collecting this material so that they wouldn't be discovered. There's a website about the archive as well called Oneg Shabbos. These are some of the photographs. Okay, number 9, embody memory in the landscape. This is a memorial that I imagine some of you will be familiar with. It's had quite a lot of attention in the international media. I think it's an amazing new memorial, a very important addition to the world of memorials. It's in Alabama, in the USA. I intended to go there when I visited my family in Birmingham, Alabama, but there was snow and we couldn't travel, so I didn't get to see it, but I've found these photographs on the internet. And it's a memorial for the victims primarily of lynching in the South of the United States. Victims of lynching, slavery, white supremacy, but this specifically about lynching. And the blocks that you can see hanging represent 800 counties in the South of the United States where lynchings took place. The memorial was designed by a group in Boston called Mass Group, and interestingly, their slogan is that they produce design that heals. Design that heals. There are, as I said, 800 columns. They're suspended. They are engraved with the names of the victims of the lynching, the victims who were often left hanging, as these columns evoke. And for those who were victims whose names were not known, they're simply listed as unknown. The information on the columns gives their name, their age, when known, and the crime, in inverted commas, that they were lynched as a result of. So, for example, frightening a white girl would have been a reason for a lynching to have taken place. And they obviously are supposed to evoke the haunting image of a body hanging from above. The memorial was a result of a huge amount of research because the history of lynchings wasn't well documented. And the team who worked on the memorial catalogued over 4,000 lynchings. This photograph shows what I think is one of the most interesting things about the memorial, because it's a memorial that is a call to action in a way. For every one of the 800 columns that's hanging in the background in the main memorial, there are duplicates lying on the ground in the area around with the same information, the county where the crimes took place, and the names of the victims. And the organisation who produced the memorial produced these duplicate stones as a call to every one of the 800 counties where the lynchings took place to reclaim their memorial, to take it back from the site in Montgomery, Alabama, and to install it somehow, respectfully, in their own county, to create a landscape of memory that doesn't exist today. the history of lynchings is criminally memorialized. And this is another image. You can see that when you approach the memorial, it looks like the things that are hanging are actually on ground level, but when you walk in, you have to enter by going down, and so they actually end up being suspended above you. And next to the memorial is a museum, a memorial museum, which is called the Legacy Museum, and it connects the history of slavery to issues of mass incarceration today in the United States. And it was actually designed by the same studio who worked on the September the 11th Memorial Museum in New York City. And it's situated in a former warehouse where enslaved people were imprisoned. And the photograph I wanted to bring to show you is jars of soil that were collected by the team who made the memorial and the museum. They were collected in every location that lynchings took place, and they've been jarred and exhibited in the museum with the names of the survivors of the lynching. I just wanted to share a quote from the man responsible for the whole project, a wonderful, very interesting man called Brian Stevenson. And he said, "I'm not interested in talking about America's history because I want to punish America. I want to liberate America." So finally, I wanted to end with this idea that we need to expose conflicting voices. When we're talking about exhibiting absence, dealing with loss and trauma, it's impossible to speak with one voice. There are multiple voices. Please forgive me for sharing something that I was involved in, but this is one of the most recent exhibitions that I curated, again for the Jewish Museum in London. It was called Jews, Money, Myth, and it looked at the history of how Jews have been connected to money, to ideas of greed and financial wealth, the history of anti-Semitic tropes around Jews and money. Very briefly, what you're looking at is a sculpture from France. This is a sculpture by an artist called Jacques Dantin, who depicted the head of the British Bank of the Rothschild family, Nathan Mayer Rothschild. And when I was researching the exhibition, I found this in a history book, and I was totally disgusted, and I thought, that's one of the worst things I've ever seen. Maybe we should get it for the exhibition. I felt very uncomfortable even asking the museum in France that have this. If you can't see it so well to describe it, it's a very grotesque depiction of Rothschild. He almost looks like sort of animal-like. He doesn't look human. He's standing on a pile of coins and money bags, and he's clutching them in a very sort of greedy and aggressive way. This is one example I wanted to bring just to show the question of exhibiting difficult material, because when we were making the exhibition, we were constantly thinking about, we were constantly asking the question, what are the ethics of showing this sort of grotesque material? What does it do? How does it help anyone to see this? In the end, we displayed it in a sort of in a slightly hidden way, so it wasn't proudly on display. It was problematized by the display. But we also decided that what we wanted to do was to show the visitors to the exhibition that actually we'd had a hard time making this exhibition, but there wasn't any consensus, there wasn't an easy process of designing this exhibition. I argued with the museum director very, very animatedly over many, many months. And in the end we said, why don't we, if we can't reach consensus, why don't we show the arguments that we had? And maybe people will be interested. So I'm sorry that this is lots of words and it's in English, but I'll read it. This is an example of one of what I called alternative captions that we exhibited throughout the museum, where there were particular things that bothered me, that I wanted people to realize they bothered me. And so next to the Rothschild sculpture is one example. And I said, I'm worried about the ethics of showing this much anti-Semitic material. The Rothschild sculpture is so gruesome, I wonder if we should even show it. And my boss said, I know what you mean, that sculpture is really upsetting. I wonder if we should find a different way to display it. How about using a mirror in the showcase and displaying the object with its back to us? I hated this idea. That way, it won't be clearly on show, people will have to make a particular effort to look at it, and will see themselves looking back as they look. And I said, I'm not sure about that. Wouldn't this be giving the sculpture too much attention? Wouldn't we be perversely treating it with too much respect? And in the end, we exhibited the sculpture with its back towards the audience, and over here, sorry, I thought I was pointing over here, but you can't see, but it's a very, very little caption on the back wall that people had to find that gave them an insight into some of the problems that we had in making the exhibition. And that's the end. I've spoken for a long time, and the idea, as I said at the beginning, was that I wanted to bring a lot of different examples. I hope not too many. I wanted to bring examples from lots of different places, and examples that maybe all of you who are here today, who work in many cases with the issue of memory in Argentina today, I wanted to bring examples that maybe could start a conversation specifically about the work that you're doing. Cecilia, do you want to explain now how we move on?
Una observación en relación a lo que acabamos de escuchar. Esto, además de que Jo es muy genia, ella en sí, hace mucho tiempo que viene trabajando para preparar todos estos casos y mostrarlos aquí durante el workshop. Es un enorme trabajo el que ha hecho ella, no solo en recopilar los casos, sino pensar en cómo esos casos podían resonar acá en Argentina, acá en este parque. Y la investigación que Jo hizo sobre la experiencia argentina y la cantidad de material que ha traído al grupo es realmente totalmente fuera de expectativas. También incluso una película sobre Boca Juniors en algún momento había alguna referencia. Eso para señalar que además de haber trabajado durante 15 años asesorando como curadora a distintos museos y trabajando en el Museo Judío de Londres, el trabajo que hizo para esta actividad en particular es realmente excepcional y no puedo dejar de agradecerlo públicamente.